Well, as I mentioned at the top of the service, Greg and I had a very relaxing vacation. We took a 10-day cruise down to Mexico. And what we love so much about cruising is that we are totally unplugged out at sea. There's no phone, no internet, no emails, totally unplugged. But there was one day at sea where it rained the whole day. And so on that one day, we did turn on the TV that was in our cabin. Now, at sea, your TV channels are very limited. So we only had 3 channels. They were BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, CNN International, and Fox News. And so Greg and I, that day, we flipped between all 3 stations. Now, 2 of those stations were covering the same story. They were covering the Mueller investigation. They were covering the trials of Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen. The other channel, however, was not covering that story at all. They were covering a story that I guess they felt was much more important. And they were covering the story on the war on Christmas. The war on Christmas, I'm sure you've heard about it. It's something that they bring up every year around this time. It's a story they're trying to get to stick. And the story is that there's a war on Christmas, that Christians in America today, we're being persecuted, we're being oppressed, because we can't say Merry Christmas anymore. We're forced to say Happy Holidays. And the pundits who were sharing this story were speaking of the term political correctness with such disdain, as if it were an evil thing. Now, I don't know about you, but it is because of political correctness that a male boss can no longer call his female secretary honey or sweetie or dollface. It is because of political correctness that a comedian cannot use the word faggot anymore. It is because of political correctness that it is no longer acceptable to use stereotypes or derogatory terms for people based on their race, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity. It's because of political correctness that it is no longer acceptable to use words like retarded and crippled. So I think political correctness is a good thing. But these pundits were saying, everybody's just so darn sensitive today. As if being sensitive was a horrible thing. To be sensitive, if you look up the word sensitivity, it means to be concerned about the interests of others. And that, my friends, is what it means to be Christian. It is what the Apostle Paul was saying in his words to the Philippians, which Greg read for us this morning. He wrote that letter to them, to the early Christians, from inside prison. And why was he in prison? The powers that be put him in prison to silence him. And what he says in that letter to them is, put on the same mind as Christ. Esteem others better than yourself. Care more about the interests of others than you do of your own self-interests. That's what it means to be Christian. So political correctness means that I care more about the interests of others than I do of my own. That's what it means to be Christian. So when stores like Starbucks and Target say Happy Holidays, it's not a war on Christians. They're doing that because they're interested in the interests of their customer base, people who are Jewish and Buddhist and Muslim and Hindu and atheist and Christian. They're doing it to be inclusive, and so should we. Between the months of November and January every year, there are 29 holidays observed by 7 of the world's major faith traditions. So I say Happy Holidays to people because I don't think mine is the only one that counts. No one is stopping you from saying Merry Christmas to people who are Christians. But I don't assume that everyone I meet is a Christian. And so I want to be inclusive. I want to be sensitive to their interests as well. That sensitivity is not a weakness. It is a strength. And it is that strength that John the Baptist is proclaiming in today's gospel message. He's saying to the crowds that have come around him, the tax collectors and soldiers, clean up your act. Start getting ready. You've got to change your ways. You can't hoard anymore. You can't fight anymore. You've got to love one another, share with one another, be kind for one another, make way for the way, clean your house, make room. And he's saying it so boldly. And that's not a message we want to hear this time of year. Like we heard in our words of integration, we don't want to keep hearing from John the Baptist during Advent. We want to hear about the baby. I mean, isn't that what Advent is about? The baby. We want to celebrate the baby. Isn't that what Advent is? We're getting ready for a birthday party for a baby. Well, I'm sorry to burst your bubble. Advent is not about the baby. Sorry. At the beginning of Advent, I shared with you in the epistle, our newsletter, a quote from our friend, Father Richard Rohr. And he said, Advent is not a sentimental time of waiting for the baby. Advent is a time to lose yourself, to surrender yourself, to empty yourself, to get rid of all that stuff that is inside of you, that ego stuff that is keeping you from loving more, keeping you from justice and oneness. And it's what John the Baptist is saying in today's gospel message. The light is on its way, but the only way that you're going to receive this light is if you clean up your house. You got to make room for the Christ light to be birthed. And there won't be room in there if you're so full of prejudice, if you're so full of worry and fear and anxiety of the other. Now, John the Baptist, of course, we know was arrested, as was Paul the Apostle, as was Jesus. Well, some of our UCC pastors were arrested this week. They were at the U.S.-Mexico border to stand in support of the migrant families seeking to enter our country. And they were arrested. They were arrested for speaking truth to the powers that be, fighting against injustice. Now, Jesus, of course, understood that injustice himself firsthand, because Jesus was a dark-skinned refugee. The Christmas story, the real Christmas story, is that Jesus' parents had to leave their home country. They had to escape in the middle of the night. They were fleeing persecution. The state was after them. And what they were trying to do was find a safe place for their child to be born. And they couldn't find that place. No one would welcome them. The baby had to be born in a stable. That's the Christmas story. And we're experiencing it right now. So some of you have seen on the news, I'm sure, that a 7-year-old migrant girl died the other day while in Border Patrol custody. She died of exhaustion and dehydration. She was a stranger, and we did not welcome her. She was thirsty, and we did not give her something to drink. I know this is not the story you want to hear about Christmas time, but it is the Christmas story. If you want to make room for the child to be born, for the light to be born, you have to care about the child at the border as much as you care about your own child and grandchild. You have to care as much for the child at the border as you do about your own safety. And in fact, it goes even further. Jesus and the Apostle Paul said, you have to esteem others better than yourself. Paul wrote, you have to care more about the interests of others than you do about your own interests. That's what it means to be Christian. And most of us don't want to do that. But the season of Advent is a time for us to let go of the ego, which so much wants for us to look at people as strangers, as the other. We've got to get rid of all of the walls and the barriers that we've built around us and within us that are keeping us from making room for the light to be born. So, this seems like a very dark time, but there is good news. It is the good news of the gospel message. It really is what John is proclaiming, is that despite this time of darkness, the light is on its way. It is, I promise. That's what our faith is all about. That's why we come here every Sunday. That's our vision, our hope, our dream, that this light, this new world is on its way. So, let us hold that hope, that vision in our hearts. The light is on its way. Let every heart prepare him room. Namaste.